Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the second day of the SAMET 2021 annual conference. Our topic this year is Growing Medtech Post-Pandemic, Adaptability, Resilience, and Sustainability. We welcome everyone back that joined us yesterday, and for those of you that is joining today for the first time, we hope that you will gain some insight and information relevant to you and your role. I am Renee Benz. I'm part of the NHI committee for SAMET and will be facilitating the session on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and what that means for the medtech industry. We look forward for this session and we request all the delegates that if you have a question for the speaker, please post it in the Q&A and the chat at the bottom so that we can have a nice conversation after the presentation. Okay, so the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is gaining traction with non-African countries, recognizing and forming partnerships within the framework thereof. Medtech suppliers may be wondering what the implications are for trading medtech under this agreement, how trade may adapt, and what the growth opportunities may be. We are joined this morning by Ms. Kirti Narsai, the Director for the Health Value Consulting and Principal Researcher for the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. Ms. Narsai has over 23 years of experience in the healthcare industry and has held several board positions of organizations including Johnson & Johnson South Africa, American Chamber of Commerce 2 South Africa, and the Nepal Business Foundation, amongst others. She has also been a member of the African Regional Business Network of the World Economic Forum for Africa. She has recently been appointed to one of the work streams on the Partnership for the African Vaccine Manufacturing, which is responsible for creating capacity for local manufacturing of vaccines in Africa. She also holds a part-time position at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, where she leads research on the pharmaceutical value chain in the context of Africa as a continent and how they will be able to supply the vaccines and manufacture it in the continent. Welcome, Ms. Narsai, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Monet, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to all of you this morning. Yes, so I have been working on the Continental Free Trade Agreement for some time now. So what is the relevance of this free trade agreement for us in the healthcare sector? I think all of us who have been working in the healthcare sector for some time now know that we have faced a lot of regulatory challenges, especially when moving products from market to market in terms of different regulations, with export requirements, with issues when it comes to custom controls, products getting stuck at borders, etc., etc. So the Continental Free Trade Agreement is going to deal with a lot of these types of issues because it's going to create a common market across the African continent. And when it's implemented, which it is now as of January this year, it is creating the world's largest free trade zone. Caroline, maybe you can move to the next slide, please. So it is going to be the world's largest free trade zone. And, you know, it is making outside entities, countries a little bit nervous because we will become a powerhouse in terms of global trade. At the moment, our intra-African trade stands at only 15% of total trade. In other words, we don't really do business with each other as African countries. And this is what this free trade agreement is trying to address. So if we just compare ourselves to other parts of the world, for instance, the EU and NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, or even the Asian countries, you can see that our intra-African trade levels are really very low. where are we in terms of this ratification, which is basically the implementation part of the free trade agreement. I think we've done exceptionally well, considering that we've got 54 member countries, which is a massive amount of countries. There's only 26 member countries in the EU, so it's more than double the amount of countries. And we've really done well in terms of getting all the member states on board with this ratification process, which is basically getting the member states to sign and agree to implement this free trade agreement. And as you can see, all 54 member countries have signed this agreement, and 30 countries have deposited their instruments of ratification, which basically means that they have gone through the processes locally in terms of their legal processes in their countries with the African Union to make sure that they are in a position to implement the requirements of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And actually, as of January of this year, goods started flowing through this free trade agreement. What's also important to note is that this free trade agreement makes provision for regional and continental value chains. And this is something that we need to take note of in terms of the Medtech sector, but also as the healthcare sector as a whole. This means that there will be opportunities to cooperate across different member states to look at what are the comparative advantages in terms of local manufacturing, in terms of getting, for instance, production inputs from other markets, etc. Next slide, please. So in terms of the healthcare sector under the Continental Free Trade Agreement, this is particularly important because it's been prioritized. And the UN Economic Commission for Africa has been driving this because it's such an important sector. And we've seen that during the pandemic. We have realized how fragile our healthcare systems are, and we've realized how externally dependent we are in terms of imports. The whole world went under lockdown and those imports came under a standstill. So we realize how vulnerable our healthcare systems are, and a lot of medicines and other healthcare commodities just came to a standstill in terms of supply chains and so on. But when we look at what is the potential, then we can see that the health and wellness sector is projected to be worth $259 billion by 2030. And so the UN Economic Commission for Africa has launched this pharmaceutical initiative pilot project in November 2019, starting off with maternal, neonatal, and child healthcare products and services through partnership with the private sector. And it's called the African Continental Free Trade Agreement Anchored Pharma Initiative. So this is essentially a pool procurement initiative across 10 countries, and it's looking at 3 parts. One is the pool procurement part. The next part is looking at a harmonized regulatory and quality framework. And the third part is looking at local production. Now, one of the things that you'll notice here is it's looking at specifically the pharmaceutical aspects and not the medtech aspects. And also when we look at all the support, the vaccination campaigns that would support the vaccine production. So I think there is a lot of opportunity for the medtech sector, but unfortunately there's not a lot of focus and awareness being given to the sector. So I think there is a lot of opportunity for all of you, for SAMED in particular, to raise this awareness with all of these organizations. Next slide, please. So what should the medical devices sector be considering? one of the things is if healthcare and pharmaceuticals are being prioritized under the Continental Free Trade Agreement, what about medical devices? So if you just look at the example that I was giving now in terms of vaccines, for instance, there are needles required, there are ampules required, there are cold chain, specialized technologies that are required in the supply chain. But I don't hear in any of the conversations that I'm involved in of anyone talking about that. When you look at also globally, those supply chains and exporters of those commodities, then there aren't any African countries that stand out as manufacturers for those commodities. So there are immense opportunities for local manufacturing of those commodities. And I would encourage that, that you look at those. There's also opportunity for looking at regional value chains in terms of driving local manufacturing for some of those commodities. So that should be investigated. We now have South Africa as being regarded as being the mRNA vaccine hub. So what are the opportunities for complementary medical device manufacturing in that space? I think that is something that needs to be explored. Then with regards to harmonization of regulation, the pandemic and also the big drive for vaccine manufacturing has also put a lot of focus on creating a lot more momentum for the AMRH initiative. And you would have seen that there's now an envoy that has been appointed to fast track the development of the African Medicines Agency. But again, there isn't a lot of talk about the regulation of medical devices at a continental level. So again, I would encourage that, the debate and dialogue around harmonization of the regulation of medical devices at a continental level be taken up by SAMED and others on the continent on how this is going to be addressed. I've read an interesting paper on, on where the regulations are at for medical devices in the, let me just have a look here, on East, Central and Southern Africa. And this paper has just been published now in 2021, but it doesn't look at the medical devices regulations at a whole continent level. So there's still room for negotiation and dialogue on how that's going to be managed. Then the next thing is, what are we going to do about continental and regional value chains? What are the opportunities there? I think there's such a great diversity of medical devices, from low-tech commodities, like when I was talking to DTI, they were talking about the problem of imports of such basic things like tongue depressors. And then you've got very high-tech medical devices like wearables and artificial, artificial intelligence and things like that. So we need to look at what are the local manufacturing opportunities. One of the statistics that I was reading recently is that 75% of medicines that are imported into developing countries are not appropriate for those contexts. And so they have to be reverse engineered to, to become appropriate for those contexts. But we need to look at what kind of innovation can take place that is African-led, that is appropriate for our environment. So there's another paper that I can recommend that everyone have a look at, which has also been published in this year, looking at two new concepts that I've come across, which is frugal innovation. And this is a paper that has been published out of the Netherlands, which looked at how does innovation happen in the medical devices sector. And it actually investigated 5 companies out of South Africa and looked at some of the capabilities that we have in the medical device sector, like engineering, for instance. Our capabilities are quite advanced in that space. But there are also some environmental barriers that we need to overcome. So I think that we have a lot going for us in terms of driving local manufacturing, but there's also environmental factors that we need to be addressing. But overall, I think that there's a lot of opportunity that we need to be pursuing in this space. And then, just looking at innovation and skills development, like I'm saying now with engineering, with innovation, we need to be nurturing that innovation so that we don't lose that innovation capital that we already have. And we need to be looking at what kind of skills do we have and what kind of skills do we need for the future. Also, in terms of, my previous point on creating regional and continental value chains, what are our collaboration opportunities with other sectors? So I mentioned the whole issue of ampules, glass ampules, for instance. And I came across another statistic which showed that Egypt, for instance, is a leading manufacturer of glass. So what are our opportunities, for instance, with collaborating with Egypt on, developing some medical devices that would use glass? We are a leading manufacturer of steel, and what are our opportunities, for instance, with collaborating with the steel industry? So these are all opportunities is looking at everyone about this from, from a broader perspective than just South Africa. So from a private sector perspective, we need to be thinking about what does that look like in terms of our representation of the sector. Are there other trade associations across the continent that one could collaborate with? There's also an African Business Council. So what is the relationship with that entity in terms of private sector representation at the continental level, etc.? Then lastly, if you are exporters, there is an opportunity to record any non-tariff barriers that you are experiencing. This is a website that is available where you can record any issues that you are experiencing. For instance, if your trucks are getting stuck at borders, if you are having regulatory challenges, etc. It's an online system that where you can record any issues that you are experiencing. So I encourage you to use this. They also have educational webinars that you can attend, which are also very useful. So I will leave it at that and take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much for that informative presentation. I just want to make a comment. In the presentation, we talk a lot about the opportunity for development and to grow business and all of that. And I think what a lot of the people on the call are wondering from different aspects of the medtech industry, whether you're a local manufacturer or importer or a multinational, wouldn't there be a negative effect to some degree by losing local business to cheaper imports by this agreement?
So the whole idea is to have a more export-orientated, market. So and to have less tariffs, right, for exporters. So if you look at how Europe does it, in terms of having a more protectionist approach for local manufacturers, what they do is they don't ban importers, but they make it a lot harder for importers to come in. So what they do is, if, for instance, in the agricultural sector, is they will just raise the tariffs for importers to make it so prohibitive that it actually doesn't make financial sense for them to import into the market at all. So that's what they do. I'm not sure exactly how they're going to deal with that here, because it is still early days and the negotiations are still ongoing. If you think about it, we only started in January. But that's an example that I can give. So, where it's seasonal, for instance, they will just raise the tariffs prohibitively so that they crowd out the importers out of the market. So that's how they do it.
All right, thank you very much. And then I think a second part to that basically is if the market or if the initiative around it is driven for a more export market, wouldn't there be some sort of risk to IP from African countries where the laws aren't in place to really protect the IPs, the potential IPs for whatever they come up with?
Yeah, so I mean, IP is a very controversial issue, and there is a whole separate section in the free trade agreement that talks about IP, and the vision is to create a continent-wide IP regime, but there will be a separate set of negotiations for that, and my understanding is that those negotiations have not commenced yet. So that's like a phase 2 negotiation on intellectual property. But it's not only intellectual property on healthcare, it's intellectual property as a whole. So it's going to look at, all different sectors, etc. There are different people involved in those negotiations. But again, I think, that's where I come back to my point on the representation. It's really important that the private sector get involved in those conversations so that you can raise those issues. On the one hand, we've got people talking about the TRIPS waiver on the vaccines, etc. And there's this move towards relaxing or waiving IP rights. And we need to be balancing that with protecting innovation, because otherwise we're going to find ourselves in a very difficult position. So we need to be very clear on what we want in terms of intellectual property, because we can't be talking about weakening IP rights on the one hand and then also asking to protect IP rights on the other. We need to be very clear about what it is that we want in terms, especially when it comes to healthcare commodities.
Okay, thank you. I see we've got one question here on the chat from Tanya. What advice or guidance? Sorry, it's just jumping around. What advice or guidance would you give SAMED in terms of getting involved in the negotiations? Who and how do we engage?
Yeah, so there's two levels, right? One is there are ongoing negotiations happening at a NEDLAC level in South Africa. So I would say that SAMED definitely needs to be involved with that. I know that there are regular meetings happening, and I would suggest that you get in touch with BUSA and others on how the representation works at that level. I know that they just had a meeting yesterday on that. So I don't know exactly how the sector representation works on that, but it would be prudent to get involved in that. So that is looking at South Africa's positioning within the context of the free trade agreement. So there's that part. But then also, there is this entity called the African Business Council, which looks at representing the private sector at a continent level. So I would say that SAMED needs to get in touch with the African Business Council. Okay, so there's a comment there saying SAMED is involved at Medtech level via BUSA. Okay, so that's sorted then. So yeah, the African Business Council is involved with the Continental Free Trade Agreement. So I would say that that is another entity at a continent level. And then, you know, also engage with the UN Economic Commission for Africa, which is looking at partnerships with the private sector. So I would recommend that as well.
All right, I'm just going through. There's a new message. Oh, okay, that's just thanking. Then there, right at the top, I'm not sure if it's a question or comment from.
That was a comment.
Comment. Okay. All right. And yeah, so I guess the other question I have from my side is, in all these value chains, in the regional and the continental value chain, what's the main implication behind it? I know you have spoken a little bit about it, but what is it? What does it exactly mean for us as a medtech industry, and how can we piggyback onto that?
So the whole idea with regional and continental value chains is it allows you to break up your manufacturing value chain across different markets to create efficiencies. So for instance, you can get your production inputs from a different market, but the whole idea is to drive efficiencies and reduce costs, and allow other countries or member states to participate in that value chain where they have a natural advantage. So for instance, if there's a country that is a key supplier of steel, for instance, and you're making implants, then it makes sense for you to get that steel from them as a production input. You know, that's just an example. To drive efficiencies and to reduce costs. So the data shows that you can reduce your costs, you know, by 15% at a minimum in your manufacturing supply chain by doing that. And we see that, you know, in manufacturing globally. So if you just think of pharmaceuticals, for instance, most of the APIs that are used in medicines come from India and China because they are the key manufacturers of APIs and they do it very cost effectively. So that is an example where you wouldn't, for instance, want to manufacture it locally because they do it cheaply and you just import it from there. But what the Continental Free Trade Agreement is asking us to do is saying, you know, look around at your neighbors, look at what their comparative advantages are. Where they can, for instance, provide production inputs and see what the opportunities are with not only for manufacturing, but maybe they can become a distribution hub. Maybe they have other capabilities that you need in terms of even skills or you know, R&D capabilities, etc. So we need to be thinking beyond our borders is essentially what the agreement is asking us to do. Overall, the objective is to become cost efficient and to become more competitive.
Yeah, and I guess that in its essence, if we can manage that, it will also take out the original risk that I asked about, and that is from a cheaper import point of view. If you are competitive enough in your manufacturing, you should technically not be worried about that.
Yes. You see, I think what we've tried to do before is, if you look at industrial policy, especially when it came to some of the pharmaceutical manufacturing that we were doing before, every country, for instance, wanted to do antiretroviral manufacturing. And then you essentially just trying to compete with your neighbor, and that doesn't help anybody. So I think, because then market access becomes a problem. Who do you sell to? How do you become competitive? It doesn't really make a more regional approach does make sense, because then you are not competing with your neighbor and you are looking at what are the natural advantages that you have. So having a more regional or continental approach, looking at what people or what companies are already doing, what they are already good at, I think that makes more sense.
Yep. Okay. I just want to make 100% sure. It doesn't seem like there is any other questions at the moment. I just want to say thank you for a very informative presentation and a really informative discussion afterwards that we had now. And I just want to ask all the attendees that there will be a poll coming up, a session poll, that if you guys can just fill that in for us as that comes up at the moment. And while you guys do that, I just want to thank you, Ms. Narsai. We appreciate the insight and the information that you shared with us today. And I hope that we can have more future engagements with you related to this whole trade agreement, and maybe guide us in certain directions where we obviously will need your guidance. Then thank you to all the delegates, the special guests, and also our session sponsor, the Korean Trade Investment Promotion Agency. And with that, if there is nothing else from anyone, I think I will close the session. Thank you. Thanks.